Discretion is advised.
All right, welcome. Here we are in Gary, Indiana, visiting two murder victims, Tamika Turks and Donna Williams, both killed in the 80s by Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. So we're going to do it a little different. It's going to be more story than cemetery today. And when we get to the victims part in the story, I'll cut in and we'll show you the graves too. So let's get right to it. Thanks for watching.
Alton Coleman was an American serial killer, along with accomplice Debra Brown, committed a crime spree across 6 states between May and July 1984 that resulted in the deaths of 8 people. Coleman, who received death sentences in 3 states, was executed by the state of Ohio in 2002. Brown was sentenced to death in Ohio and Indiana, but the sentences were later reduced to life imprisonment without parole and 140 years, respectively. Alton Coleman was born on November 6, 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois. His mother worked 3 jobs, and he lived with his 73-year-old grandmother. Coleman was well known to Illinois law enforcement, having been charged with sex crimes 6 times between 1973 and 1983. 2 of those cases were dismissed, with Coleman pleading guilty to lesser charges in 2 and twice being acquitted. He was scheduled to go on trial in Illinois on charges stemming from the rape of a 14-year-old girl when he fled and began his killing spree. Coleman was diagnosed with mixed personality disorder with probable antisocial, narcissistic, and obsessive features, with additional diagnoses including epileptic spasms, psychosis, and borderline personality disorder. Debra Brown was born on November 11, 1962. She is one of 11 children, is borderline intellectually disabled, suffered head trauma as a child, and was diagnosed with dependent personality disorder by a psychiatrist. She was engaged to another man when she met Coleman in 1983, but left her family and moved in with him shortly afterwards. Although a willing participant in Coleman's assaults and murders, Brown had no history of violence or any criminal history prior to their relationship. Coleman and Brown committed their first murder when they killed 9-year-old Vernita Wheat from Kenosha, Wisconsin. After Coleman had befriended her mother, Juanita Wheat, he abducted Vernita and took her to Waukegan on May 29, 1984. Vernita's badly decomposed body was discovered on June 19th in an abandoned building 4 blocks from the apartment of Coleman's grandmother. It was determined she had been raped, and the cause of death was ligature strangulation. On May 31st, Coleman befriended Robert Carpenter in Waukegan, Illinois, and spent the night at his home. The next day, he borrowed Carpenter's car to go to the store and never returned. In June 1984, Coleman and Brown encountered 2 young girls in Gary, Indiana, 9-year-old Annie Redacted and her niece, 7-year-old Tamika Turks. The couple sexually assaulted the 2 children. Annie survived the violent attack, but Tamika did not. Her partially decomposed body was discovered on June 19th.
And here's Tamika right here. Poor child. Poor kid was doing nothing wrong besides being a kid, right? Bless your heart, child. Such a sad, terrible waste of life. 1984. Got some help to find the grave here, and the guy was telling me that her mother has the grave lifted up, leveled every year. That's beautiful. Rest in peace, Tamika. God bless you.
The pattern seems to be that while Coleman, accompanied by Brown, perpetrates acts of violence against almost anyone he comes in contact with.
Authorities believe Coleman began his spree of murder and rape at the end of May, when he allegedly abducted 2 little girls in Gary, Indiana. One just raped and beat. The other he also murdered.
She had multiple contusions about her. She had a cord around her neck, and she had a footprint on her chest, and her right hand was tied with evidently a piece of her shirt.
The day after 7-year-old Tamika Turks was found in Gary, the body of another child, 9-year-old Vernita Wheat, was found in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The 9-year-old was the daughter of a woman Coleman had become friends with.
The same day, Donna Williams, a 25-year-old woman from Gary, disappeared. On July 11th, her decomposed body was discovered in Detroit, Michigan, about half a mile from where her car was found. She had been raped and killed by ligature strangulation.
Here's Donna right here. 1959 to 1984. So sorry this happened to you. Terrible. Rest in peace, Donna.
On June 28th, Coleman and Brown entered the home of Palmer Jones and his wife, Marjorie of Dearborn Heights, Michigan, whom they beat severely. Coleman ripped the telephone from their wall before stealing money and their car. On July 5th, Coleman and Brown arrived in Toledo, Ohio, where Coleman befriended Virginia Temple, the mother of several children. After Temple stopped communicating with her relatives, police entered her home and found her young children alone and frightened. Temple and her eldest child, 9-year-old Rochelle, had been strangled to death and left in a crawl space. On the same morning as the Temple murders, Coleman and Brown entered the home of Frank and Dorothy Duvendak in Toledo, who were bound with electrical cords. The couple stole the Duvendaks' money and car, and Mrs. Duvendak's stolen watch was later found under another victim. Later that day, Coleman and Brown visited the Dayton home of the Reverend Millard Gay and his wife, Catherine. The two stayed with the Gays and accompanied them to a religious service on July 9th. The next day, the Gays dropped off the couple in downtown Cincinnati. On July 12th, Tunny Story, a 15-year-old girl who lived in Cincinnati's Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, disappeared. Her body was discovered 8 days later. A bracelet that had been stolen from the Temples was found under Story's body. On the day of Story's disappearance, the FBI appended Coleman to its 10 most wanted list as a special edition, the 11th most wanted. Coleman was the 10th person since the initiation of the list in 1950 to merit such inclusion. Coleman and Brown bicycled into Norwood on July 13th, about 9:30 a.m. Less than 3 hours later, they drove away in a car belonging to Harry Walters, whom they left unconscious, and his wife, Marlene, who was beaten to death. Harry Walters survived and later testified that he and his wife had met Coleman and Brown to discuss their potential purchase of a camper, and that Coleman attacked him with a wooden candlestick. The coroner found that Marlene had been bludgeoned about 20 to 25 times. Shards of a broken soda bottle which bore Coleman's fingerprints were found in the Walters living room, and bloody prints made by 2 pairs of shoes were found in the basement. The Walters' red Plymouth Reliant money, jewelry, and shoes were stolen. 2 bicycles, clothes, and shoes not belonging to the Walters had been left behind. 2 days later, the Plymouth was found abandoned in Kentucky, where Coleman and Brown had kidnapped Oline Carmichael Jr., a college professor from Williamsburg, and drove back to Ohio with Carmichael locked in the trunk of his car. On July 17th, they abandoned this stolen vehicle in Dayton, and Carmichael, who was still locked in the trunk, was rescued by authorities. Coleman and Brown returned to the home of the Gays, accosting them with guns. Reverend Gay, who at this time recognized Coleman as a wanted fugitive, asked, "Why you want to do us like that, like this?" Coleman responded, "I'm not going to kill you, but we generally kill them where we go." Then Coleman beat him and took their car and headed back toward Evanston, Illinois. Along the way, they stole another car in Indianapolis and killed its owner, 75-year-old Eugene Scott. 3 days later, On July 20th, Coleman and Brown were arrested in Evanston. As they walked westward across an intersection, they passed immediately in front of a motorist who was from Coleman's neighborhood in Waukegan, Illinois. The motorist drove north to a gas station and notified the police from a payphone. The couple were spotted by a copter sitting on bleachers in empty Mason Park. Soon, 2 police sergeants approached Coleman. Brown was observed walking away toward the rear of the park. 2 other officers stopped Brown as she tried to exit the park, searched her, and found a gun in her purse. The pair were taken into custody without incident and transported to the Evanston police station, where both were identified by their fingerprints. As Coleman was strip searched, a knife was found between 2 pairs of sweat socks he was wearing. A shopping bag full of varied t-shirts and caps was found in the couple's possession. Officers learned that the pair stopped every 3 to 4 blocks as they walked and changed shirts and caps. A week after their arrest, more than 50 law enforcement officials from 6 jurisdictions met to plan their strategy for prosecuting Coleman and Brown. Seeking the death penalty for Coleman and Brown, Michigan was quickly ruled out because it did not employ capital punishment. It was decided to give Ohio the first attempt at sentencing, with U.S. Attorney Dan K. Webb stating, "We are convinced that prosecution, in Ohio, can most quickly and most likely result in the swiftest imposition of the death penalty against Alton Coleman and Debra Brown." The state of Ohio convicted Coleman and Brown, finding them guilty of the rape and murder of Tunny Story in Cincinnati and Marlene Walters in Norwood, but not for the murders of Virginia and Rochelle Temple in Toledo. Coleman and Brown were both sentenced to death. Coleman's case was sent to the U.S. Supreme Court several times between 1985 and 2002, but his numerous arguments that his conviction and death sentence were unconstitutional failed to sway the justices. However, Coleman's death sentence in relation to the Story killing was overturned in a separate proceeding. Despite this, Coleman's death sentence in relation to the Walters murder remained upheld. In addition to the death sentences, Coleman and Brown were each sentenced to 20 years in prison for transporting their kidnapping victim, Oline Carmichael, across a state line.
The application of such a code must be continued until you are dead. The warden of the time of notice of appeal will be filed on your behalf. You understand those rights, sir? The court has searched for some evidence of mitigating factors that would, in some small, legitimate way, cause one to find a plausible explanation for the defendant's inexcusable conduct. The court has found none.
You've just been sentenced to death twice. Don't you have anything to say?
What was unfair about your trial?
On April 25, 2002, the Ohio Supreme Court rejected a claim by Coleman's attorneys that the state's plan to accommodate the large number of victims and survivors who wanted to view the execution would turn it into a spectator sport. So many victims and survivors of Coleman's crimes were allowed to witness the execution that prison officials had to set up a closed-circuit viewing venue outside of the building. For his last meal, Coleman ordered a well-done filet mignon smothered with mushrooms, fried chicken breasts, a salad with French dressing, sweet potato pie topped with whipped cream, French fries, collard greens, onion rings, cornbread, broccoli with melted cheese, biscuits and gravy, and cherry Coke. Before his execution, he released a letter apologizing for what he'd done. On April 26th, reciting Psalm 23, Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection in the death chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. Reginald Wilkinson, director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, said Coleman had not directly expressed remorse for the killings, but that he had admitted what he's done in his own convoluted way. Brown, who was originally sentenced to be executed in Ohio for her complicity in the crimes, had her death sentence commuted to life imprisonment by Governor Richard Celeste in 1991. In commuting Brown's sentence, Celeste cited her low IQ scores, ranging from 59 to 74, and her master-slave relationship with Coleman influencing her actions. Brown was one of 8 Ohio death row inmates, including all 4 of Ohio's female death row inmates, to have her sentence commuted by Celeste, a staunch opponent of capital punishment, a week before he left office. Despite her nonviolent history before the spree, Brown was initially unrepentant for her acts. During the sentencing phase of her first Ohio trial, she sent a note to the judge which read, in part, "I killed the bitch and I don't give a damn. I had fun out of it." She was also given a death sentence for the murder of Tamika Turks in Indiana. However, that sentence was ultimately commuted to 140 years imprisonment in 2018. Brown is currently serving her sentence without possibility of parole at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Dayton, Ohio. She finally expressed remorse for her crimes when she apologized to the victims' families in a video in 2005. Some authorities believe that Coleman and Brown, who are both Afro-American, usually selected black victims because they knew they would blend in better in the black community, noting that their crimes lacked a racial motive. However, on page 184 in The Anatomy of Motive, John E. Douglas, a retired FBI profiler, states that Coleman, in the middle of a vicious sexual assault, went into a practically incoherent tirade about how blacks were forcing him to rape and murder other blacks, as if that could somehow explain and justify his actions. Coleman and Brown left a racist slogan, "All information is alleged," written in lipstick at the scene of the rape and murder of Tunny Story, one of their victims who was not Afro-American.